and welcome to another episode of That 60s Recording Podcast, the podcast that has conversations inspired by the golden era of recording. As I said last week, we are taking a brief detour away from the 60s, which I know I do a lot because I get guests who are modern guests on, but this time it's a genuine historical detour that is 1 year outside of the 60s, but it's part of the golden era of recording, and these are pretty massive albums, so I thought it was appropriate. I'm speaking with, actually just this episode, I'm speaking with Jason Kruppa, but as of last episode, it was Jason Kruppa and Ken Womack, who have written a fantastic book called All Things Must Pass Away, Harrison, Clapton, and Other Assorted Love Songs, that tells the story of Eric Clapton and George Harrison's relationship and how it culminated in the two seminal albums that are All Things Must Pass and Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs. In this episode, we sort of go into a bit more detail about the sessions themselves and that kind of stuff. So a bit more appropriate to this podcast, I suppose. So we'll just dive straight in. Here we go. Part 2 of my conversation with Ken Womack and Jason Kruppa. We'll just briefly go through where George was at before the recording of All Things Must Pass, or the sessions began, because that was pretty interesting to me. That he wrote It Don't Come Easy with Ringo. He was producing some of that stuff. He was doing a lot of producing. He produced Billy Preston's record, and he even managed to sit in on a Bob Dylan session. I think in the US, was that?
Yeah, that was in May, right?
Yeah, it just seemed, I didn't realize quite how prolific he was in the period of time leading up to the beginning of those sessions. It's almost like he'd been let loose from the Beatles, and he was just having a great time writing songs and discovering who he was outside of the confines of that band.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they finish Abbey Road and he just doesn't stop. He's working on the Billy Preston album. He's working on Doris Troy. And he's off with Delaney and Bonnie, and he's writing all these other, he's still writing songs, and he does do It Don't Come Easy with Ringo. It ultimately ends up producing that. When it starts, people I'm sure know this, but it starts with George Martin sort of producing a demo, and then George takes over and it becomes his thing. But yeah, he remarks on this at some point in early 1970, just before he's working on his own album. He's like, well, I've sort of become a producer, and that's not who I want to be. But he was having these great experiences, and again, gathering around him a group of musicians that he really vibed with. And, he talks about this also in early 1970, how he wants to have an Apple house band, sort of like Motown does, or, Stax or something. So he's bringing these people together and thinking, well, we can turn this into something for Apple artists. They can always have people to call on for session musicians. And then that basically becomes his house band for his album. All those people that he's drawing in, he just starts calling on them once these sessions start. So, he is, exploring a lot, certainly. And I think, he brings all that to this album. That enriches everything he does with this record, everything that, that's going on in 69 and early 70 that he's working on.
So then moving into the sort of the sessions themselves, how did you even go about trying to piece that together? I mean, so it was all recorded in Studio 3 in Abbey Road.
Just about, yeah.
Yeah, and there was lots of musicians present, and as you've just mentioned, there was a sort of core house band, if you like, and then kind of people would come in. How did you even, there was no records of who played on what during those sessions, so how did you even begin to start piecing that together?
Well, there's no way to get a definitive list, just because there are so many people, and it changed from session to session. And George would, invite people in who just happened to be passing by. So, John Leckie, who was the second engineer, was writing all the stuff down. I interviewed him basically walked through the sessions with him day by day and got his memories of things. He didn't have time to write everything down. He may not have known everybody that was actually coming in the room. And so, he's just trying to keep up with what he has to do as a tape op. And so, all this is happening and everyone's just trying to keep up with what they need to do. So the best thing that I could do was come up again with the timeline where I say, okay, well, I know that Ringo is out of the country on these dates. And I know that Badfinger is on tour these dates. And I know that, Jim Gordon isn't in the UK until this date or around this date. So I began to figure out, like, okay, these people could not have possibly played on this session, but they might have played on that session. So it was a lot of just detective work, and the whole famous Phil Collins story about playing on Art of Dying. I don't think he's on Art of Dying. I don't hear congas on there, but I place him on another song where it's the only song in the album that has congas. So it's stuff like that where it's like, okay, I have to take a look at this and I have to really listen to the tracks, and then I have to look at, what people are remembering, which in some cases is not right, even though they're not making anything up. It's just 50 years have gone by and memories are blurred, and you record a lot of sessions, and some things over that time are going to blend together. So you're going to remember something that maybe happened on another date or another session or another album. And, that's just how memory works. So you have to be aware of that when you're interviewing people and when you're piecing all this together. And there's still things that I think that I could change or fix. People are still calling me and emailing me and sending me like, oh, I found this, do you know about this? So, it never ends. And, so it is you have to walk a line, I think. And it's, there's still things that I have questions about where I think, oh God, I got that wrong. And, and so far it looks pretty good, but you do the best you can with something like this because it's 50 years on, and like, there's nothing was written down in terms of who played what. So it was taking all of that data and the interviews and the stuff that was written down as far as dates and things like that, and then determining how all of these pieces fit together. And it took a long time to sort of work all that stuff out. And the one thing that I struggled with for the longest time is how Derek and the Dominoes formed and when they were actually present, because the story has always been that they were there from day one, and they were basically the house band for the record, which doesn't seem to be the case based on where people were at certain times, where especially Carl Radle and Jim Gordon seem to have come in a little bit later, maybe even a couple of weeks into the sessions. And I just thought, well, that can't be true because everybody's saying that they were there from day one and they remember this, but it just once I started piecing it together, it seemed like, well, this has to be this, you can't argue with certain facts, like where people are. So, it's things like that where, and I'm still expecting somebody to email me and go, no, I have a piece of paper right here that says that what you wrote cannot possibly be true. And I'm just waiting for that email. No, but so far, everybody's like, nope, you got it right. That's true. That sounds about right.
Well, it's the risk you take when you publish something, isn't it? I suppose.
Yeah, for sure. So, I'm happy to accept any other information that counteracts what I have. But, this is what we had when we wrote the book, and this, these are the conclusions we came to.
Was there any particular standout sort of revelations, maybe not even particularly concrete, but things that you sort of deduced or worked out that must have been the case? I mean, what the particular thing that springs to mind is the two drummers conception of that album, that people conceive that there's two drummers on it, but as you say in the book, there must not be.
Right. It's and there again, it's varying perspectives on this. It seems like there were two drum sets in the studio ready. So Alan White's set, and then Ringo's, and then when Jim Gordon comes in and Ringo's left, then it's mainly, I think, Jim Gordon at that time, because at that point later in the sessions, Derek and the Dominoes kind of take over. You can hear the energy once you know what songs they are in that period. You can kind of make sense of like, oh, okay, well, that's why that sounds like that. Yeah, that was another one I struggled with, and I actually emailed you about that, because like, what do you think about this? Because Alan White told me that he didn't play with another drummer, at the same time, so that really kind of threw things into question. I mean, the other thing that really, I mean, there are a lot of things that were surprises, just little surprises, but one thing that surprised me, that kind of sticks with me, is that what Phil Spector was like at these sessions, what his actual role was, and how he worked with George, how he worked with the musicians. Because there's the stories of Phil Spector, wild man, waving a pistol around, and that wasn't the Phil Spector at these sessions. No. He would tell jokes, and he would cut up, and he had a lot of energy, and a very distinctive personality. But the people that we spoke to said, he was in control. He was contributing. It was a collaboration with George. That's how Klaus characterized it, as like a collaboration or a partnership. And, at some point he does become unstable later on in this process. But for the tracking sessions where he, that's really his atmosphere, that's really his thing, he shines. He's in control, and I think he's really on top of things at that point. So it was to me really, really kind of striking to see all these subtleties. So because we have 50 years of myth built up behind this record, and to sort of get close to it and dig in and go into each session and talk to the people who were there, it's sort of, I started seeing these sort of, everything seemed to be much different than what we've come to believe over the years. So it's, there was a lot of myth busting. I think, the broad strokes of it maybe are true, but these, as you get into the details, you realize, oh, this is a much more complex story than what we've been led to believe all these years.
What do you think Spector viewed this record as being? Because it was, his career wasn't in the best place when he started to work with the Beatles. And right. What was how did he perceive what this record was going to do for him, or what his sort of, obviously not what his role was, but what he was looking to achieve professionally from this record?
Well, I think working with John on Instant Karma, and then taking over Let It Be, and then going to this, it's sort of like he's found the second phase of his career. He's done his Phyllis records in LA, and he's retired from the record business for a couple of years, and I think he was looking around for what he was going to do next. And he kind of dabbled in a couple of things before this, but then with the Beatles, it's here's an opportunity to really show what he can do. And so I think for him, it's it's like here's kind of rebirth of my career. And as you say, he was not in a great place. He'd sort of flamed out with River Deep Mountain High. And felt really crushed by the failure of that record, even though they loved it in England. It just didn't make much of an impact at all in America, and he took that personally. So it took him a while to come back from that, and then he's in England, and he shows up on Instant Karma, and he kind of takes control of that at George's urging, and his relationship with them develops from there. And so with John and George, I think he sees an opportunity to not, he's kind of doing the wall of sound, but especially with John keeps him under tighter control.
Yeah.
George kind of lets him do his thing, to a certain extent. There's a push and pull, at these sessions where George is sort of scaling back the musicians in the room, and he wants a more intimate recording. The sort of like country inflected tunes are an example of that. But to get back to your question, from Spector's point of view, I think, it's a chance for him to, to be a pop producer again, to sort of step into that world that he feels like he should be in because he was successful for a period of time, and, he can be successful again.
I particularly enjoyed there's one bit you talk about there being 15 tambourines on Wah Wah. That's mental.
Yeah, I mean that's Alan White talking about how Spector wanted to do these overdubs. So they had only 8 tracks, and so they're bouncing from track to track as they record each one, and building up layers of tambourines. So that may be an exaggeration, but it was a lot of overdubbing like that, and that's just right at the first session. So and that's again, that's Spector sort of showing his things like, okay, well, I do a room full of musicians, and so this is what I'm going to do. So you've got all these people crammed into Studio 3, and he's essentially kind of doing his wall of sound thing with that.
There seemed to just be a bit of an open house for musicians to come in. I love the Chris Thomas story where he says, like it was almost choreographed that every 5 minutes these globally famous people would just stroll through the door, and they seem to get like more and more famous.
Right.
It just seems like it was the who's who of that scene was there contributing, and there didn't seem to be any limits.
Right. Yeah. And Alan. Oh God, I just blanked. I'm sorry. Alan Parsons. Yes, you've heard of him. He said how he came to a few sessions, and anytime somebody would show up, George would just hand them a guitar and tell them to join in. So it's very open house. And Klaus also said that George would get a sense of what was happening, and he would maybe want to clear the studio out. He didn't want to have as many people, and he wanted to do something that was more controlled. He wanted something that would fit the mood of the song.
Yeah, so there was definitely some musical consideration happening. It wasn't a complete free-for-all.
Right.
How I'm interested in the sort of formation of Derek and the Dominoes, and how particularly the story of Jim Gordon coming in and playing percussion on one of the sessions, I think, and doing it in exchange for studio time with Eric. I can't remember the details of the story, and my notes don't seem to be helping me. But there seems to be some exchange of time for players that sort of aids, Eric Clapton recording a single.
Right. Well, so Eric and Bobby Whitlock were there from the very beginning. Bobby had come over to England to, ostensibly form a band with Eric. That's sort of how it came into play. That may not have been the initial intent, but it was sort of like, well, he gets over there and he's played with Delaney and Bonnie. He knows him. He's played on that solo album in January 1970 with Clapton. So he's thinking, here's somebody I can go maybe connect with somehow. And they begin playing and writing songs together. And then George has his sessions, so they get swept up into that. And they decide they're going to form a band, and they pick Carl Radel from Delaney and Bonnie, and they pick Jim Keltner as their drummer.
Yes.
And Keltner he is occupied recording a jazz album with Gabor Szabo, and will not be. I've just discovered, because I talked to a journalist who interviewed Jim Keltner about this recently, and he asked Jim Keltner to look at his diary, and Keltner had in his diary, he had it blocked out that he would be recording until sometime in August, I think.
Okay.
So he would not have been available for this June 14th date that they have where they, Derek and the Dominoes plays for the first time. So that date seems to have kind of come up without much planning. Meanwhile, Jim Gordon has gotten wind of the fact that Eric Clapton is forming a new band, and he just shows up in England. And I think it's Carl who told him this, because Carl was going to be a part of the band. So there's a session on June 10th where Clapton is producing. He's going to start producing an album for P.P. Arnold, the soul singer, and so Bobby's there. Carl was supposed to be there, but apparently he gets lost, and another bass player from a session at the same studio comes in and sits in. And Jim Gordon shows up and is like, I'm here. And so he gets drafted into the band because of that, because they got this gig they've agreed to do on the 14th, and they don't have a drummer, even though they have placed ads in the music papers that list Jim Keltner as the drummer.
Ah.
Yeah, and we reproduce that in the book, so you can see one of the music paper ads. It has his name in there, so they're still holding on to this sense whenever they place this ad, which would have been somewhere in that first week of June. They think Keltner's going to be able to be there, but Gordon shows up, and they're like, "Okay, well, you're in the band. You're here. We need you. Welcome. you're in Eric Clapton's new band, right?" Yeah. So we call that a power move on Jim Gordon's part, where he just comes in and he's he takes Jim Keltner's spot. Keltner would not have been available, like I said, until August. So presumably it was Clapton and Robert Stigwood, his manager, were looking at a tour to promote that solo album recorded in January, because it was coming out in August. So what I've been able to piece together is that they were saying, okay, well, we need a band to promote this album, so we'll have Jim Keltner come in when he's finished with that jazz record. But things take a turn because Jim Gordon shows up. They do this gig on the 14th. They realize, they've got fire, and they just go back to Eric's place and they start jamming. And then they're playing on the last couple of weeks of George's album, where you can really hear them catch fire. Mm-hmm. So, that's probably not very clear. It's much clearer in the book, I promise. But that's sort of how this, it's not planned at all. It's all very freewheeling, and just how people show up and like, oh, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. So very kind of seat of your pants, the way this band comes together, and, just has that sort of brilliant flame to it.
Why do you think that Eric Clapton needs to be in a band almost? I mean, George is being a solo artist. Eric has released solo records. Why do they decide to go with Derek and the Dominoes? And why not sort of just Eric Clapton or Eric? The session that they played was noted down as George Harrison and Friends, wasn't it? And then it goes changed to Eric Clapton and Friends, and it just sort of intrigued me as to why Eric always seemed to need to be in a band context, and why he didn't just go out on his own.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to this wanting to. I mean, Ken has shown this picture of them at the Hammersmith Odeon, where it's everybody that's playing on the bill, and George and the Beatles are up front. Eric is hiding in the back, literally hiding. You could barely see him. And it's just that he seems to shun the spotlight. And the whole thing about naming Derek and the Dominoes is, it obscures his identity. It's totally from a PR perspective, it's a disaster because like who's Derek? Who's Derek and the Dominoes? And which is, Robert Stigwood's Derek is Eric, the badges that he hands out just so people know who it is. I think he was not comfortable being fully in the spotlight and saying, I'm the leader, I'm the solo guy. He just, and again, it goes back to what Delaney was, pushing him to do, to take the spotlight and showing him that he could do that. But clearly, even by the middle of the year, he wasn't prepared for that. He wanted this band and he wanted to play with these people and he wanted to create this particular type of music, but he was not comfortable walking out and saying, I am Eric Clapton, because, on the one hand, he's being very, I think, generous to the people around him, where he's saying, like, I am not the only star here. We need to pay attention to the other people that I'm playing with. And it needs to be considered a band. So in that sense, that, obscuring his identity in Derek and the Dominoes was to say, don't think of this as an Eric Clapton band. Think of this as this group, which, it's not one person just sort of standing out and determining what this is going to be.
So during the All Things Must Pass sessions, the Derek and the Dominoes band was sort of set up at Eric's house in Hurtwood Edge. They had a bit of like a permanent rehearsal space, and they were sort of becoming familiar with each other a bit more at this, throughout the back end of this process anyway. So presumably when they weren't recording with George, they were together, sort of musically just jamming and coming up with ideas. Right.
They once they played that gig on the 14th, they moved into Hurtwood Edge and they just jammed all the time, and they did a lot of drugs at the same time. So Clapton talks about how, it's amazing that they survived, that they just had so many chemicals running through their bodies. But, it was something they couldn't sustain. But for that period, George's sessions, they continued to deliver. They showed up and they just played and played and played. And the jams, some of the jamming is coming out of that too.
Yeah. So the Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs was recorded in Miami, which I sort of thought was quite fitting in a way. I mean, there seemed to be, I don't know whether this was something that you guys contributed to, but for some reason, the whole book, Eric Clapton and who he surrounded himself with smacked of sort of American and blues. And George seemed very British. Like, it all seemed, Alan White was playing drums, and it all felt very British to me. And for some reason, Eric's choices all seemed very American to me. So it seemed to make sense that he'd go over there to record the album.
Right. I mean, he had the experience working with Atlantic, not necessarily in that studio, but with the producer. And God, I just blanked again. I'm so sorry. It's been a rough couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll just edit that in at some point. So he had experience, and he could have recorded in England, but he even recorded his first album in America, in LA. The Eric Clapton album.
Mm-hmm.
So, but definitely the blues are coming from America. So, it would make sense that he, would be drawn in some way to these American musicians. And, the Delaney and Bonnie thing has so much of that. It's not just blues, it's rock, it's gospel. It's, it's all these things sort of woven together in that group. And so, he taking these musicians who are in that group is going to give him some element of that vibe already. And, then Duane Allman, the Allman Brothers, just that connection, that sparked something in him too, where, they talk about how the sessions weren't really turning into anything. And then Duane Allman comes in, and it just, it sort of kicks things into gear. Then they can begin recording. And, that's when the magic happens on that album.
The sessions themselves seem relatively more straightforward than the All Things Must Pass sessions. And you can see very clearly the sort of influences, obviously the song Layla being sort of a tribute to Pattie Boyd, and then Little Wing cover. There's a passage in the book about Clapton being particularly excited to show that to Jimi Hendrix, and And you can sort of see, again, the same with George, that there's this sort of culmination of years of songwriting and him blossoming into a songwriter. You can see the journey to this album from Clapton, how it culminates in, his experiences and what he's feeling at that time and who he's met. And it's all, you can see that really laid clearly on the track listing on the album.
Yeah, I mean, he's sort of found this sweet spot for himself where he can express these things that he's been wanting to express. And Bobby Whitlock is a very good foil for him at this time. It's really a shame that all of that what they found in this couldn't continue, because I think they brought a lot of good things out of each other from a songwriting perspective. So I think I just lost track of your question, but
it was more of a comment on on where he was and how the album had sort of culminated in all of his influences up until that point, and he'd somehow managed to distill them in a way that is represented so clearly on that album.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I mean, again, to go back to Duane Allman, it's just, what he brought to that record was, cannot be underestimated. And, Clapton wanted him to join Derek and the Dominoes, and Duane Allman apparently was, torn because he wanted to be with his own band, but then he had this offer, and I think he felt the excitement too. Something recently that came up, found online, someone was writing a book about Duane Allman, and they had access to his letters, and he had written a letter to his wife saying, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but
yeah,
that he was, he's uncertain about what to do, that he's got to decide which way he's going to go. But he seemed to be seriously considering it, at least for a brief moment. So, that's a big part of this, is that, Clapton connected with Duane Allman in this really powerful way. And that just adds another layer to all of this.
Do you think, I mean, this is sort of maybe the ultimate question, but do you think that Clapton would have achieved this album, if you want to phrase it like that, had he not been around for the All Things Must Pass sessions?
I mean, it's really hard to say. I think the fact that all of these elements came together during the All Things Must Pass sessions tells us that, that experience, that atmosphere, the fact that George was doing this and inviting Clapton and inviting Bobby Whitlock facilitated all of this. All of that, all of these pieces sort of came into place because George was recording that album. And, certainly Clapton knew, he knew Carl and he knew Jim Gordon, but he was choosing Jim Keltner. And, this isn't necessarily in the book, but I'm coming to this as we talk about this, and I've talked to, done other interviews about this, but,
yeah,
let's pretend that George isn't recording this album, and Bobby shows up at Eric's house at Hurtwood Edge, and they're playing together and they're writing songs, and they say, okay, we're going to start a band. And they call Carl and they get Jim Keltner, and they go, okay, we're going to promote this album. It's going to come out in August. Keltner's going to be done in August. He comes over. This is what they do. They rehearse, they get together, and they promote the Eric Clapton album. And that's the official beginning of his solo career. And whatever happens after that. I mean, who knows what happens after that. But, so that to me is like, if you take All Things Must Pass out of the picture, then, do these other things come into play? Is all this, maybe so. Maybe Robert Stigwood, was moving pieces around, and that was having a greater effect. But I think the fact that they're playing together on those sessions, just as, they have that first gig at the Lyceum, and they're discovering their power as a group. I think that had some kind of an effect. Maybe they would have still formed otherwise, but slightly different circumstance. I think George gave them an opportunity, and then he gave them, session time to record that single. Even though it was withdrawn, they kind of got that out of their system. And you listen to it, and it does kind of sound like an Allman Brothers record a little bit. And with Spectre producing, so it's a very different sound than they're gonna find in Miami.
Yes.
So, but they have to get through that in order to sort of discover, like, okay, well, who are we really? And at that point, I think that's who they thought they were. And it's a good record. I mean, everybody's probably heard it, but it's definitely worth seeking out. And then, it becomes something else. But I think, in an alternate universe, maybe that band still gets together. Maybe that band still happens. Obviously, a lot of this is driven by Eric's angst about Patty. Mm-hmm. So there's that, so it's really like, you can't really pick these things apart.
No.
So I'm basically, deconstructing my own argument here.
Well, you say you can't pick them apart, but I'm really enjoying listening to you try.
Yeah. No. So I'm trying to pick it apart, and I'm showing you how this doesn't work. So, I mean, I think the fact that they're on All Things Must Pass, and I think that George is doing this, and I think the fact that they're in each other's lives is so much an important part of how Layla comes to be.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, it's even I tried to prove myself wrong, but
that's. I mean, I have to just sort of say that the book is. I've said it at the beginning. It's so well written, and I love the fact that it's a story that we almost didn't know needed to be told. It's like as you guys said at the start of this conversation, it's almost staring you in the face. Like, surely someone's done this before. And the more, as I was reading it, the more I was interested in, the more it all did come together and did sort of explain itself that it needed to be told, and that both of these sort of seminal albums came out of that relationship. And I just want to congratulate you on finding a story that did need to be told and telling it so brilliantly.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, we definitely appreciate that. I mean, the personal aspect of this, with the the love triangle and the going into their backstories, is all. You can't separate that. It's like you see, you can't unpick these things from each other. But to me, and I think to Ken too, the central thing is that we want to talk about the music. We want people to walk away from this, or put the book down and want to go back to the records and hear something new as a result of what we've written, or you hear these albums in a different way. You hear them with a greater understanding of what these people were going through at the time. So yeah, if it's hard to be objective when you've written something, but if I appreciate you saying that, because it's good to hear that the whole story makes sense.
Well, I mean, it's certainly done it for me. I won't listen to them in the same way again, and I hope that people who've listened to this conversation and hopefully will go out and buy the book and read it for themselves, and they'll go through exactly the same. They'll listen to the album with fresh ears. It's almost given a reason. I mean, All Things Must Pass it's a long record. It's great to listen to, but to have to know all of the background about it. And I found myself trying to work out musicians after our email conversation.
Right.
I'm listening to it. I really enjoy sort of really picking apart what instrumentation is going on there and how it's all fitting together. And it's freshened up my perspective on it, and I've really enjoyed it. And I think and I hope it will be the same for everybody else that kind of reads all this and finds all this information out for themselves.
Yes, thank you. I hope so too. We would. That's our ultimate hope for this.
I mean, last time we spoke, we were talking about your podcast, and I asked you what's happening next, and what was happening next was this book.
Yes.
What's happening next?
Well, so Ken and we lost him a few minutes ago.
Yes.
Unfortunately, but we are working on a book about Beatles in 1974, sort of the year they officially on paper broke up, as opposed to when they broke up in 1970. And I've been trying to find time to work on the podcast. I'm chipping away at episodes. Some are written and just need to be recorded, and others are in a much more nebulous state. But so people are interested producing the Beatles. There are, I think, 11 episodes up now, and stay tuned for more, because they will be coming, I promise.
I mean, as we said in our first conversation, each of those episodes is such a huge body of work, and it's not like these where I just have a conversation and put it out there. You slave over them. Each of those 11 is like a little book in itself.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of production, and I'm doing 2 on All Things Must Pass, on the making of 2 of the songs. So there'll be a lot of information there I don't think people have heard before. Some of the outtakes may be familiar to people who collect these things, but as I was writing this, I thought, oh God, I have to do a couple of episodes on the songs, because I just had so much material, interviews and new things I'd found. So those will be bonus episodes before I get to the actual new second season. So coming as soon as I can make them.
Fantastic. So just to wrap it up, the book is called All Things Must Pass Away, Harrison, Clapton, and Other Assorted Love Songs. You can just get it. I mean, in the UK, if you're listening, it's just on Amazon. I mean, that's where I bought mine from. And in the US, presumably, that's the best place to buy it too.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Unless there's can you buy it directly through you guys?
No, go through Amazon, or if you have a local bookstore that you like, I always say go to your local bookseller.
Of course.
I like to support small bookstores, local bookstores. So, check it out.
Super. Thanks so much. And I can't wait to talk to you again about 1974 in an 18 months time or 2 years time.
Yeah, probably so. Yeah. Give us a little time.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jason.
All right. Thanks a lot.
There we have it. And I absolutely do urge you to go and buy that book. It is fantastic. I've read, and some of you may have read, Ken Womack's books on George Martin, and they're just absolutely brilliant. I mean, I'm kind of lost for words. They're just, I mean, they're just fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. 2-parters on George Martin. And Jason's podcast on Producing the Beatles podcast is also fantastic. So it made complete sense that this book was going to be fantastic. Not only is it incredibly well written, but the information in it is, a lot of it's new, and it's been presented in a way that if you are familiar with the Beatles, then it's still very interesting, and it doesn't dwell on a lot of the information that's out there already. But then if you're new to the Beatles, it goes into just enough depth that you get a pretty good background on that kind of stuff. I can't imagine many people listening to this are that new to the Beatles, but anyway, it's an incredibly well written book, and I absolutely recommend you go and buy it. So that just leaves me to say a huge thank you to you all for listening. If you'd like to support this podcast by buying a lovely enamel mug, you can do that at my website, allyouneedisdrums.com, and there is a link to the shop there. Thanks so much to everybody that has bought one already. I really appreciate you supporting this podcast. I would love to say a huge thank you to Rory Hancock for editing the podcast and uploading it and all of that jazz. To Joe Kane for the intro and outro music, who I am pretty sure by the time this comes out, I will have spoken to him again about his Poppermost project, and hopefully that will be on an episode shortly after this one. And finally, a big thank you to David Henshaw for the artwork he supplies. You guys have a fantastic week, and I will see you next Tuesday. Goodbye!